Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Hi everyone, my name is Maulida Syauqina Rahman, and today's video is a bit different. Instead of one topic, I'm walking you through everything we covered in this semester in Methodology of Islamic Studies. Think of this as a highlight reel from our very first class all the way to the last one. Our roadmap, before we jump in, here's a quick look at everything we're covering, 12 meetings in total, starting with the history of Islamic studies, moving through the core teachings and these sources, and ending with how Islamic is studied differently around the world. Let's go through them one by one. Meeting 1 is about history and growth of Islamic studies. Let's start from the beginning. Literally, meeting 1 is all about how Islamic studies grew into what it is today. Basically, it has two big goals: understanding faith and building real scientific knowledge. Early scholars didn't just stop at theology, they branched out into things like ilmu kalam, usul fiqh, hadith studies, and Quranic exegesis. And it wasn't happening in just one place. Four cities became the real hotspot: Baghdad with its Nizamiyah school, Cairo's Al-Azhar, Cordova over in Andalusia, and Kairawan in Morocco. Over time, the scholars themselves changed too. You've got the classical names like Ibn Sina and Al-Ghazali laying the groundwork, then modern thinkers like Al-Tahtawi and Muhammad Abduh pushing back against new challenges. And now, in our own time, things have split into different camps: traditionalists, modernists, reformists, you name it. So really, this whole journey stretches all the way from the Prophet's era to the universities we study in today. Meeting 2, religion in human life. Okay, now that we've got the history down, let's zoom in on something more personal. Why do we even need a religion in our everyday lives? If we wonder where the word religion even comes from, turns out it has two roots. In Sanskrit, it basically means non-celtic. So keeping order. In Arabic, al-din points to submission or a whole way to life, and honestly, everyone defines it a little differently. The Indonesian dictionary has its versions, and scholars like Mukti Ali and Haruna Sution each bring their own angle. But no matter how you define it, religion does 5 big jobs for us. It points us toward truth. It tells us things our sense alone cannot grasp. It shapes our morals. It sets the rules for worship and law, and it becomes a source of knowledge itself. On top of that, it shapes who we are, guides how we treat others, and hold communities together. And here's a neat distinction. Religions generally fall into 2 buckets. And the first is Samawi, the ones that come straight from divine revelation, and the second is Ardi, the one that grew out of human culture. Meeting 3, dimension of Islamic teaching. Cool, so that's religion in the big picture. Now let's zoom in on Islam specifically. What actually makes its teaching think of Islamic teaching as standing on 3 legs. First, there is Aqidah or faith. This is all about a believing in God built on ideas like Tawhid, certainty, believing in the unseen universality, and fitrah or our natural human disposition. Second, there is Sharia or law, which covers 2 sides: ibadah, our worship connecting us to God, and muamalah, how we deal with other people. And Islamic law itself has some nice qualities. It's comprehensive, it stays flexible, and honestly, it's always aiming for maslahat, the common good. Third leg is akhlaq, our moral character, which shapes how we actually behave today, day to day. Put these 3 together and you get a framework that still holds up in today's world. 4. Religious research versus religious studies research. Now we've got the foundation down. Let's look at 2 research fields that sound similar but are actually pretty different. Penelitian agama and penelitian keagamaan. Religious research or penelitian agama digs into a religion's core teachings, scripture, theology, law, the whole concept of God. It traces religious teaching as truth, lens on a theological lens, and cares more about the text than what people actually do. Religious studies research or penelitian keagamaan flips that around. It looks at how believers actually behave, studies religion as social phenomenon, and uses a more empirical approach to understand the reality on the ground. And if you want to go deeper, scholars actually break this down into 6 different models: normative, theological, historical, sociological, anthropological, phenomenological, and interdisciplinary. Each one gives you a slightly different lens to look through. Meeting 5: Islam and Universal Ideas. Alright, beyond just studying religion, Islam makes a pretty bold claim that it speaks to every single human being. Islam isn't meant for just one group of people, it means for everyone, no matter your race or where you're from. Surah Sabah, verse 28, literally calls the Prophet a messenger for all of mankind. And there's hadith from Bukhari that say the best people are the one who benefits others. To actually study this universal message, scholars lean on 3 tools. And the first is tafsir mawdu'i, which is thematic interpretation. And then maqasid syariah, the bigger goals behind Islamic law and mix of hermeneutic with historical analysis. Speaking of maqasid syariah, it protects 5 essential things: faith, life, and the intellect, family, lineage, and property. And how do Muslims actually try to live out this universal idea? 3 ways of really building a well-rounded, moderate understanding of Islam: keeping the door open for interfaith dialogue, and just applying Islamic values in everyday life. Do that and you get peace and fairer society, stronger brotherhood, and better dialogue between faiths. Now, this idea of universalism also runs into some tricky territory. Fundamentalism is basically reading religious texts in very rigid, literal way, often rejecting other views. It tends to grow out of things like modernization, social injustice, or an identity crisis. There's also this exclusive versus inclusive Islam debate. Exclusive Islam says there is only one correct interpretation, which is, while inclusive Islam stays open to other perspectives without giving up its core faith. And to wrap out this segment, there is the idea Islamization of science, basically blending scientific knowledge with Islamic values, where science stays empirical but also carries a spiritual dimension. And then, meeting 6 sources and characteristics of Islamic teaching. Now that we've seen how universal Islam message is, let's rewind a bit and look at where the message actually comes from. There is a clear order to it. At the top, you've got the Quran and Hadith, the primary sources. Right below them, you've got ijma, scholarly consensus, qiyas, analogy, and ijtihad, independent reasoning, which all work as secondary sources. Together, these sources do 4 jobs. They guide us, and then they help us tell right from wrong, they heal, and they warn us when needed. Now, scholar Yusuf Al-Qaradawi actually laid out 7 traits that describe Islamic teaching as a whole. It's Rabbaniyah, rooted its divine guidance; Insaniyah, centered on human welfare; Shumuliyah, comprehensive; Waqi'iyah, realistic; Wasatiyah, balanced, without clear. And it holds both Thabat and Tawatur. Some things stay constant, and while the methods can adapt, you'll notice these traits showing up everywhere, from belief and worship to education and social life. And then, it is 7, Tafsir Al-Quran. We just mentioned the Quran as a core source, so let's dig a little deeper into how scholars actually interpret it. Tafsir means explanation, but in everyday language and in religious terms, and it does a lot of heavy lifting, clarifying vocabulary, guiding how we live, preventing misunderstanding, and pulling out literal ruling and wisdom from the text. This whole practice actually goes back to the Prophet himself, who explained the Quran directly to people. After him, his companions stepped in and used their own ijtihad to interpret trickier verse, and the generation after them, the Tabi'in, keep building on that. Eventually, tafsir grew into its own proper discipline, splitting into 2 main styles, and it's still evolving today. You'll find thematic tafsir, tafsir built around specific scholars, living Quran studies, manuscript research, and all sorts of newer approaches. And then meeting 8, Hadith as a source. Right next to the Quran sits the second big source of Islamic teaching. Hadith, it refers to the saying, action, and approvals of Prophet. Every single hadith is built from two parts: the sanad, which is the chain of people passing it down, and the matan, actual content itself. Researchers check both of these carefully to make sure a hadith is actually authentic. Classic method for this include tahrij, tracing a hadith back to where it comes from, jarh wa ta'dil, checking how trustworthy each narrator was, and just directly analyzing the sanad and matan. Over the years, quite a few scholars shaped this whole field, names like Mustafa al-Sibai, al-Ghazali, Quraishi, Hab, and al-Iraqi. And of course, this research keeps evolving with newer models using more modern academic tools. And then, meeting 9, ijtihad as a source and method. Beyond the Quran and Hadith, that there is actually a third tool. Islamic law relies on independent reasoning or ijtihad. It's basically scholar rolling up their sleeves and working out a legal ruling on their own using solid reasoning. But not just anyone can do this. Becoming a mujtahid takes serious requirements like deep knowledge of Arabic, the Quran, and Hadith. Within ijtihad, scholars actually use a whole textbook, told book of methods, qiyas, analytical reasoning, ijma, consensus, istihsan, juristic preference, maslahat or musalat, public interest, istishab, presuming things stays as they are, and or local custom. And honestly, ijtihad matters a lot because it lets Islamic teaching keep answering new situations as the world changes. The Quran and Sunnah stay the foundation, but ijtihad is what helps fill in the gaps. And then meeting 10, Bayani, Burhani, and Irfani approaches. Right after ijtihad, there is one more piece of the puzzle. How do scholars actually blend text, reason, and spirituality together? Here is a fun one. There are 3 approaches that all try to answer the same question, just from completely different angles. First up is Bayani, from Al-Bayan, meaning explanation. This approach leans entirely on text, mainly the Quran and Hadith, treating revelation as the top authority. Its main sources are the Quran, Hadith, Ijma, and Qiyas, and the scholars most linked to it is Imam Shafi'i. Next, there is Burhani, from Al-Burhan, meaning proof or strong argument. This one leans on reason, logic, rational argument, instead entering Islamic through Greek philosophy during the Abbasid era, picked up by thinkers like Al-Kindi, Al-Farabi, Ibn Sina, and especially Ibn Rus. It's objective and testable, but it can end up missing the spiritual side of things, and that's exactly where Irfani comes in. Irfani is all about inner experience, though called Wijdan Basira, tapping into spiritual experience, going through worship, dhikr, and purifying the soul, aiming for a direct kind of knowing called ma'rifat. Big name here include Al-Ghazali, Ibn Arabi, Rumi, and Al-Hallaj. So here's the takeaway. Bayani keeps us grounded in the text, Burhani keeps us sharp and rational, and Irfani keeps us spiritually connected. Real understanding comes from balancing all 3. And then, meeting 11, dynamics of contemporary Islam. Alright, with text, reason, and spirit all covered, let's jump into something more modern. How does Islam actually engage with today's world? Contemporary Islam is reading Islamic teaching in a way that fits today without ever letting go of the Quran and Hadith as the core sources. What's pushing this shift? Mainly 3 things: globalization and tech, advance in science, and just general social and cultural change. And you can stop contemporary Islamic thinking by a few traits as contextual, rational, dynamic, and stays open to ijtihad. When a new problem show up, you'll see contemporary Islam show up in 5 areas: Sharia, economic and finance, education, tech and digital, media, law and social life, and health. But it's not all smooth sailing. There are internal challenges like polarized thinking, and then overly literal reading of text and radicalism, plus external ones like secularism, liberalism, and general moral crisis in society. And then, to wrap up our journey in meeting 12, conceptualizing area studies of Islam, let's zoom way out and see how Islamic studies actually looks different depending on where in the world you're standing. Islam doesn't look the same everywhere because it's shaped by each region, geography, history, society, culture, politics, and economy. This whole field actually ties back to Orientalism. Western uh, scholars were the one who first studied the Islamic world this way. Sure, their work helped preserve a ton of manuscript and literature, but it also got criticized for being tangled up with colonial interests. So every studies came along as a more objective, more contextual way of doing things. Over in the West, Islamic studies grew out of the alignment and Orientalist scholarship moving through three stage and theological stage early on, political stage around the 12th century, and final the scientific stage in modern times. Indonesia, meanwhile, has its own flavor as the largest Muslim country in the world. It blends Western and Middle Eastern approaches, leans heavily into religious moderation, and still holds onto a local culture. Three pillars really holds this up: pesantren, the integration of religious and general knowledge, and big organizations like Nahdlatul Ulama and Muhammadiyah. Zooming into the Middle East, a few places stand out: Egypt, Al-Azhar, a hub for jurisprudence since the 10th century; Saudi Arabia, leaning into classical Hanbali and Salafi texts; Iran, mixing traditional Shia theology and with modern university programs; and Turkey, carrying in its Ottoman heritage into a scholar republic. When it comes to actually studying Islam, there are two broad lanes: the traditional lane sticking to the Quran, Hadith, and classical fiqh, and the modern lane bringing in historical, social, and interdisciplinary tools. Of course, it's not without challenge. Tension between tradition and change, the internet and social media, and ongoing questions around gender. Put it all side by side, and the pattern is clear. The West treats Islam as an object and of critical study. The wider Islamic world treats its a normative guide for life, and Indonesian takes this integrative, moderate middle path. And then, for closing and reflection, that's wrap on our journey through Studi Islam, through Metodologi Studi Islam. Looking back, we started with history, moved through what religion and Islamic teaching actually mean, dug into each core source, and finally zoomed out to see how Islamic studies looks different around the world. Honestly, if there is one thing this course told me, is that Islamic studies is never really finished. It keeps growing through history, adapting to new contexts, and staying open to different methods. And a few points in that lesson isn't just academic. It changed how I read the text, how I judge a source, and how I respect different views within one shared faith. Thanks so much for sticking around for this whole recap. How Pete gave you a clearer picture of everything we covered this semester. See you in the next one. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.